thanks, Warren, for setting us up. That was such an awesome presentation. So I'm really stoked to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking with you around the regulation of plastics, specifically focusing on plastic packaging. And I'm going to hone in on this example of plastic packaging product stewardship, because we have a scheme that's currently being designed in New Zealand, so it's very topical. So I'm going to talk about what plastic packaging product stewardship even is. I'm going to talk about its potential to change the way that we regulate plastics by essentially helping us to turn off the tap, like what Warren was talking about. But I'm going to discuss some risks in the way that New Zealand is approaching scheme design that may mean that we risk ending up at a bottom of the cliff, mopping up the mess scenario, like recycling our way to more waste. So I'm going to draw on look at international examples and think about what lessons we can learn, and then apply that back in the New Zealand context to think about what we could do about the current scheme underway and how we might be able to get that on track for a really awesome scheme. So what is it that we are talking about? We are basically, in August 2019, the government put out a public consultation document asking everyone, do you think that we should declare plastic packaging a priority product? So what that means is that when the minister of the time, you Jamie, hello, declares a plastic packaging priority product under Section 9 of the Waste Minimisation Act, what that means is it becomes compulsory that a scheme, product stewardship scheme, must be designed and accredited. What is a product stewardship scheme? Essentially, it is about producers taking responsibility for the environmental impact of their product at every stage of its life. And taking responsibility pretty much means changing the way it moves through the system, but also financing that. So the public thought that was a pretty good idea and said so. And so in July 2020, the minister of the time declared plastic packaging a priority product. And so now a scheme must be designed and accredited, and the deadline was given for July 2023. Nobody sort of rushed to put their hand up to design this scheme, but eventually, just a couple of months ago, the government announced that 2 industry groups are going to be in charge of the scheme co-design process, and that was going to be the Packaging Forum and the Food and Grocery Council. And so off they go. So what are the key points that I want to convey to you today? Firstly, going with an industry-led scheme design process is quite problematic, because the point of product stewardship is to sort of require businesses to start to pay their way, paying for things that they haven't been paying for before, and essentially maybe also reducing the amount of product they put on the market. So this is inherently creates a conflict of interest, because you're asking the vested interest groups to maybe think about reducing their profits, possibly. So this risks an under-ambitious scheme that essentially doesn't get us to the top of the waste hierarchy. Is this just a theoretical problem, though? Well, what we're seeing in practice already is that both the government and the industry-led groups are already, before they've even started designing the scheme, in public commentary starting to narrow the scope of the scheme to be focusing on collecting end-of-life packaging. This is very inconsistent with the government's vision of creating a circular economy for Aotearoa. It also doesn't even get close to addressing what we know about the nature and causes of plastic pollution from an informed scientific perspective. And it doesn't sit well with international trends around regulating products such as packaging, including but not limited to the conversations around the Global Plastics Treaty, which New Zealand is part of. And so if we want to have a scheme that includes measures that are actually proportionate to the scale of the plastic pollution crisis, in all likelihood, we're going to need some independent oversight of this scheme design process at the very least. So these are the key points, but I want to zoom out for a moment and just get a little bit of a sense of the bigger picture context. Reality check moment, but the pollution that is coming from plastic production, use, and waste is having severe impacts, as we all know, on humans, but on the planet, on wildlife, flora, fauna, ecosystems, and increasingly we're seeing phrases like catastrophic. And even within the impacts on humans, this is felt unevenly between different societies. in a way that reflects inequities and injustice. So Emma talked before about how even the production of plastic tends to be located in lower income neighbourhoods around the world. Pacific Island countries, some research that Tricia put out with some other upper members last year is that, in 2020, is that Pacific Island countries contribute like maximum 1.3% of global plastic mismanaged waste, but are disproportionately impacted by that. And here in Aotearoa, the impacts of plastic pollution are impacting tangata whenua rights to taonga that are protected under the treaty. So it's clear that without very big change in policy direction, not a little bit of a tweaking here and there, but big change, these negative impacts are going to increase dramatically over time. So we are sleepwalking into uncharted territory, but we're starting to charter the territory that we're sleepwalking into. So you've probably all heard of the planetary boundaries framework. So there's 9 planetary boundaries, and these we're supposed to stay within to have a safe operating space for humanity. One of these planetary boundaries is called novel entities. So novel entities are materials, substances that are new in a geological sense. They include plastic, but also a whole bunch of chemicals, including chemicals that go into making plastic, like PFAS and so on. So this planetary boundary of novel entities was not calculated until January this year. And this is a tweet from Kate Brolworth, who invented the donut economics framework. This is big and bleak news, because you can see in the image on the right there, massive overshoot of this planetary boundary. We are so outside the safe operating space, it's terrifying. And the authors of this report basically said, from their findings, we recommend taking urgent action to reduce the harm associated with exceeding the boundary by reducing the production and the releases of novel entities. And as I mentioned, that includes plastics. In fact, plastics is the primary chunk of the thing that's putting us into overshoot. So what that means is we have to reduce the amount of plastic coming into the global economy. And increasingly, academics, well, who've been saying this for a very long time, saying it even more, scientists and so on. In this recent article in Science magazine, we had this statement around ensuring the safety of every available plastic and chemical is impossible. This isn't a pathway that we can achieve. And so what we need to do to prevent plastic pollution is to have a total phase out of virgin plastic production by 2040. So in a nutshell, as you know, the Global Plastics Treaty is being negotiated. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, put out a tweet and a speech to the countries of the UN and said, plastics are fossil fuels in another form. I call on countries to look beyond waste and turn off the tap on plastic. So again, what Warren's been talking about. So how does this all relate to plastic packaging? Well, regulating plastic packaging and turning the tap off on that is absolutely critical to this bigger picture goal of turning off the tap on plastic. Why? Because packaging is the single biggest market for plastic globally at least 31% and disproportionately large plastic waste generation at 40%. In New Zealand, 60% of the plastic that we import to make products into gets turned into packaging. And so, as the United Nations Environment Programme said, the need for alternative to single-use packaging is clear. So what does this all mean for us? It means we can't turn off the plastic tap without completely changing our society's approach to packaging, but also we can't go around regulating plastic packaging without acknowledging this bigger picture conversation. All right, so let's come back home. So, as I mentioned, July 2020, plastic packaging declared a priority product. Yay! So, what does this actually mean? Well, this is the scope of the priority products declaration. All plastic packaging for consumer goods, retail or wholesale, all resin codes from 1 to 7, and it includes packaging that has a plastic component, even if it's not 100%. So for example, if you've got a brown paper bag lined with plastic, that's going to come into this, and it includes compostables as well. Doesn't include products that are intended to be refilled. So this is a pretty broad definition. There are some limitations of this definition. I don't have time to go into. If you want to know about them, you could ask, but I'm going to skip over that. But let's just say broad. So this means that anybody using this type of packaging needs to be subject to, well, a product stewardship scheme for that product needs to be developed. So what is product stewardship? Let's go to the Waste Minimisation Act. Part 8, Section 8 defines it broadly, which is requiring the people and organisations involved in the life of a product, so the life of a product, to take responsibility for ensuring there is effective reduction, reuse, recycling, recovery of that product. So that's our friendly waste hierarchy in there. And managing any environmental harm arising from the product when it becomes waste. So this then draws in not just the stuff that goes to landfill, but also the stuff that never makes it to landfill. So plastic pollution, that's environmental harm arising from the product when it becomes waste. Okay, so we're looking at all of that too. So this is a pretty broad definition, leaves space for ambitious schemes that cover full product life cycles. Yay! MFB on their website also have a summary of product stewardship, and this is what it says. When regulations are used to increase circular resource use and place responsibilities for managing end-of-life products on producers and so on. Interesting, quite different. So, circular. We don't know what that means. It's not defined in the Waste Minimisation Act. Could be good, could be meaningless. Resource, interesting, because it's about product stewardship, not resource stewardship. And so resources are useful to a point, but when you're talking about products and wanting to move up the waste hierarchy, you actually want to be looking at products which are resources plus embodied energy. And so by focusing on resource use, you start to move back down that waste hierarchy. Also use presupposes that we're going to be using these things in the first place. This really gets my goat, if that's a phrase, I don't know. I make things up sometimes. End of life has suddenly appeared. Remember in the Waste Minimisation Act, the life of a product? So this has come, so where has this definition come from? Well, under the Waste Minimisation Act, when a minister declares a priority product, they can also, under Section 12, create guidelines to give some guidance to scheme designers about what are the expected contents and effects of these schemes. So this was done. And this is where we start to see this language coming through. So we've got circular resource use, focusing on, this is a really interesting one, increase end-of-life management of priority products higher up the waste hierarchy. Yeah, so you can see, and then we've got internalizing end-of-life costs. So we're not talking about internalizing costs to shift up the waste hierarchy. So these guidelines were intended to give greater direction to the design of product stewardship schemes, but in actual fact, they've created a bit of confusion and have also unwittingly limited the scope of the scheme ambition. So I would say it's a little bit of an own goal from the government there. The other issue that we face is that the Waste Minimisation Act doesn't say how schemes should be designed and who should design them. It just uses the fabulous passive voice, scheme must be designed. So anybody could have been put in charge, but the policy decision that was made by the government was that it was going to be industry-led. So all product stewardship schemes, not just plastic packaging, industry-led, because industry knows best about their products. I've written about this before, so I don't want to harp on about it for a very long time, but in essence, it's like putting the fox in charge of the hen house, because you've got the regulated community designing the rules to regulate themselves. Be that as it may, plastic packaging product stewardship scheme design is now underway, and in September 2022, the now Minister David Parker announced that it was going to be industry-led, co-design between the Packaging Forum and the Food and Grocery Council. Interestingly, though, it's 75% funded using public money, but we don't have 75% leadership. Okay, but are we to be worried? Is it all going to be fine? Well, here are some of the scene-setting things that have come out in public information, press releases and so on. When the minister made this announcement, he said, once this scheme is in place, it will require producers, brand owners, importers, retailers, and consumers to take responsibility for collecting and dealing with plastic packaging. The independent chair, ultimately, the project will look at how plastic is currently collected or not, and whether there is a more efficient and effective way to do this. And the CE of the Packaging Forum, Rob Langford, as industry, we have a responsibility to deal with the end-of-life recovery of packaging. So as we can see in the public comms so far, and this is just the public comms, we don't know what, terms of reference or anything like that, but the public comms so far have firstly no mention of plastic pollution or cleanup of both legacy plastic packaging pollution and future, no mention of activity higher up the waste hierarchy, and reducing production and consumption, definitely not mentioned. So I guess my question is an industry design scheme to increase the efficiency and efficacy of plastic packaging, end-of-life plastic packaging, likely to turn up the plastic tap? Asking for a friend. Okay, so this has come from the United Nations Environment Programme, who prepared some preparatory documents for the Global Plastics Treaty negotiation for countries. And I kind of want to look at this question of end-of-life plastic packaging and focus on this diagram, which isn't perfect, but it's useful, to just look at the life cycle or the lifespan of plastic packaging. So as you can see, you've got the extraction of natural resources. That's where it starts, predominantly oil. Then we're going to have to add some chemicals and additives and stuff to turn it into plastic packaging. To turn it into plastic resin. And then we're designing and producing products. Those products are distributed. Maybe they're reused after initial use. Then they come into this phase where they're collected back, maybe repaired, refurbished, recycled, or go to landfill and incineration. What's missing from this diagram is the stuff that actually slips off the edge there into the environment. But we'll put that on because we know that's there. Okay, so where our scheme is going to be focused is on this little guy here, collection. But also just remembering that the stuff that's collected isn't necessarily going to actually be recycled back into plastic packaging. It might be downcycled. So this perfect loop isn't really actually going to be a loop. So when you look at the full life cycle of plastic, it really suggests there's more going on than simply collecting end-of-life plastic. For example, are we going to redesign products so that we don't have harmful chemicals in this plastic in the first place? Are we going to change the way products are designed so they can be reusable and refillable rather than just single-use disposable? Are we going to look at how we're going to recycle things back into themselves? And if we can't, we go back to that. So, there's so many more questions beyond just collecting end-of-life packaging. What are the international trends in this space? I think the first thing to recognize is that a lot of countries have been grappling with product stewardship as a tool for getting up the waste hierarchy, and there's still a lot of work to be done. But a lot of countries are further ahead than us and are already starting to have these conversations that product stewardship schemes or extended producer responsibility needs to start incorporating activities that go up the waste hierarchy and actually look at the full lifespan of products. So don't freak out when I put these up. This is just examples, you don't need to read them. But we've got Upstream, which is the foremost reusable packaging organization in the US, saying exactly this conversation. The United Nations Environment Programme recently put out a summary of member states' submissions on the Global Plastics Treaty and what people want to get out of it. And these member states were saying we need to start looking at the links between extended producer responsibility and upstream and midstream goals. And the UN Environment Programme saying the same thing. Product stewardship needs to be looking at things like reuse targets and all that. So in Europe, the EU Commission has developed proposals for updating their packaging waste floors. And these proposals are quite interesting. They have three main objectives. So this is for regulating plastics in Europe. The first is that the overarching goal is to prevent the generation of packaging waste. And this is to reduce it in quantity, restrict unnecessary packaging, promote reuse and refill, boost closed loop recycling, and reduce the need for primary extraction of raw materials through greater use of secondary raw materials, i.e. recycled content. So as you can see, collection is important to these things, but it's only part of it. The Global Plastics Treaty, which we'll hear lots more about tomorrow, has an extremely broad mandate that focuses on regulating to address the full life cycle of plastic, promoting sustainable production and consumption, eliminating plastic pollution through prevention, reduction and elimination processes, and critically, scientific assessments that underpin all of this stuff. So I put up before how the UN Environment Programme produced a document summarising 21 submissions from member states on the key issues they'd like to see this treaty address. And again, we're looking at reducing production of virgin plastics, sustainable product design, reducing and eliminating single-use plastics, reducing harmful chemicals as additives, innovating more sustainable alternatives, which can include reuse and repair, and just reducing consumption in the use phase. This treaty has also got a coalition, a high ambition coalition, which is a whole bunch of almost 50 countries who are pushing for a high ambition treaty. And New Zealand has joined this coalition. Recognise the work of upper members, especially Priscilla, and really pushing for this outcome. So this high ambition coalition, they have 3 strategic goals and 7 key deliverables. Just to focus on the strategic goals: restrain plastic consumption and production, enable a circular economy for plastics, achieve environmentally sound management and recycling of plastic waste. So New Zealand's part of this. So thinking about how are we aligning what we're looking for at the international level with our domestic policy. What can we take from all of this international stuff? To be meaningful and effective, regulating plastic packaging, including turning off the tap, needs to take into account the scientific consensus around the urgency and scale of the crisis. And 21st century global conversations about regulating plastic aren't just looking at collection for recycling, but also reducing production and consumption, making plastics safer by monitoring and phasing out chemical additives of concern, requiring sustainable alternatives, including reuse and refill, closing the loop on recycling, not just downcycling, and creating responsibility to prevent and mitigate plastic pollution with financial mechanisms coming from producers to pay for this, and a push to inform all of these conversations with independent science, not industry-led science. So what all this tells us is that for our plastic packaging scheme design process, at the very least, the following measures should be on the table for discussion: redesign, reduction, and reuse of plastic packaging, which includes binding consumption reduction targets for plastic packaging, levying virgin material usage, mandatory disclosure of the chemical additives in packaging, and looking at phasing out whole classes of concern, support for a reusable packaging, a single-use packaging levy and reusable packaging targets, but these should be material agnostic, meaning for any material, not because what we don't want to see is purely plastic reusables. Yes, collection is important, and we should be striving for collection rates of at least 90%. And minimum access requirements. So, all communities in New Zealand should be able to access these. And also recycled content targets for packaging, only if this can be achieved without compromising human health. Then, in terms of the cost internalization for producers, this is really critical. Producer fees need to cover the full costs of recovering for both reuse and recycling, but they also need to cover cleanup costs for the plastic packaging that escapes waste management systems. And a proportion of producer fees need to be redirected to reuse and refill infrastructure for packaging. And we need transparency of data. This needs to be mandatory. And that data goes right back to companies being transparent about the amount of plastic packaging by unit as well as tonnage that they put on the market. So how do we get this on the table in New Zealand? Well, to a certain extent, the horse is already bolted as a result of the scheme already being designed. But there are some options that could be considered and that could be called for. One is to just accelerate a government-led independent technical advisory group to sit over the top of the scheme design process, a little bit like what was done for the container return scheme. So it's been done before, it could be done again. It would be great to have more public articulation of our expectations as a community to come from the scheme so that at least the final scheme can be held accountable by members of the public. And also in the longer term, I think we really do need to update those product stewardship scheme design guidelines and the Waste Minimisation Act to strengthen this whole scheme design process in the longer term. Like, do we want to commit to industry-led schemes for all schemes going forward? And do we want to have more expectations around scheme outcomes in the legislation? So that's me. Thank you very much for listening.
Someone's lined up any time for 1 or 2 questions.
So I'm in terms of the scheme design, I noticed that it recently doesn't look to be for one. And that process, but certainly doesn't look over. And yeah, I'm just interested to know whether there's been around that.
Yeah, so the question from Kali, from the Thematis, was around is there scope for mana whenua being at the table in that scheme design process? And so the answer is broadly, like, I don't know, I'm not privy to the conversations, obviously, that are going on between the ministry and the industry groups who are leading the scheme design and so on. But broadly speaking, the Waste Minimisation Act itself has no provisions around Te Tiriti o Waitangi at all, and no indication in the scheme design process of who should be involved. So the legislation really needs to be updated to include those things, but even so, and the guidelines as well. I think there is a little bit of mention of iwi involvement, but it's not elevated beyond stakeholder. So in essence, we don't have a very good framework for scheme design that would protect those rights throughout the process. Yeah, I would say that I would be surprised if there was anything more than someone representing Māori in the co-design team. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question though. Kisia?
I just wanted to yeah, I mean, independent science and knowledge, why kind of topics in this process? Because what we're starting to develop is an independent science legislation, and then states have been screening out for it. And now it's very important that it's included not just traditional Western knowledge, science, knowledge, but it's must include indigenous people's knowledge of white knowledge of traditional society, citizen science, and in order to ensure that industry science doesn't mislead and isn't only this in negotiations. And I think that would be here.
Yeah, so what Kisia just said in a nutshell, she's been really involved in the Global Plastics Treaty negotiations, is that there's work being done to call for an independent scientific working group to be able to inform and develop science to inform the negotiations. And it's really important that that working group includes not just sort of Western science, but bringing in Indigenous knowledge from around the world to be a critical part of developing the science in that working group, and that we really need something similar in New Zealand to inform the product stewardship scheme design process.
Thank you so much, Heather.